Welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Jordan Davidson, a staff writer here at the Federalist. Today I'm joined by Nathan Leamer, who is a newly homeschooled dad. He's also the vice president of Targeted Victory and the co-host of a new podcast called Reclaiming My Time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nathan.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's go ahead and start with kind of your experience. We know that students have been out of school now or majority of students around the nation have been out of school now for a year, sort of bouncing around between Zoom calls and maybe a hybrid learning experience. What has your family been like in that time?
Yeah, so when we're here in Fairfax County public school system, and we had a great school, Stratford Landing Elementary School, wonderful first grade teacher for my then 7-year-old daughter, India. But we, right after the COVID hit and we started going online, Fairfax County had a little bit of trouble getting online. It actually took an extra month for them to get online. And so there was this period of time between March, I think like 15th or 16th and mid-April where kids weren't doing anything and they were just at home and there was no real plans. And so instead of going back to online programming, my wife and I decided to homeschool our kids, pull our kids out. We have an 8-year-old now. She was 7 at the time, and then a now 5-year-old who will be in kindergarten next year. But we decided to start homeschooling late last year, and then we decided to continue homeschooling all through this year. And we look to continue kind of doing a homeschool program going forward. You know, we found that there was an opportunity for us to reject the premise, if you will, that we had to do the public school thing or had to, find a private school that could get us in, but that we could take ownership over what our kids are going to learn and how they can move forward in the process ahead.
Yeah, that's great. So walk me through a little bit. How much virtual schooling did your kids partake in, if any?
Not very much. I think we participated in like a couple weeks of it, and then my wife was quickly like, "This isn't the way forward. Let's just homeschool." And I really support that decision and like the idea of it because I came from a teaching background. I was a high school history teacher right out of college. I had plans of being a teacher, and so I understand how the public schools should work and how the structure should be and how we could enable kids to move ahead and have educational opportunities, but also that the limitations as they were at Fairfax County and as they kind of look to be throughout this year, this kind of hybrid system where you have asynchronous learning on Mondays, and then hybrid program. Maybe you're in school, maybe you're not. And then the schools, as you see over the past year, they kind of look like bubbles, the classrooms, and we just didn't want to deal with that. And we kind of saw where this was going, and I think the pressures that's put on parents and that basically discouraging parents to make the right decision for themselves. When we were doing the virtual learning starting out last spring, and this was maybe the death knell for Fairfax County in my mind, was they sent an email saying that we couldn't do pods. They discouraged pods. So they didn't want kids getting together because the assumption was that it would exacerbate racial and socioeconomic disparities, because the assumption that the Fairfax County Public Schools decided was that I, being a white Protestant 35-year-old guy, and my family would only associate with people who look and sounded like me. But the reality is my daughter's best friends and the kids in our neighborhoods look nothing like her. They have names that sound nothing like India Leamer, and they have different experiences. And so if we were to have had a pod, it would have been a very diverse community that was a pod. But we were told that's a bad idea. That could, exacerbate current problems. And that to me was just like too much thinking from the top that doesn't account for the individual circumstances that our family has, and just these overgeneralizations that I was not a fan of.
Sure. And I think that's an interesting point, is not only did you guys have trouble with the learning and academic aspect, but your children have completely lost their social access and, the kind of effects that may have. And what have you seen in your own kids and maybe in your community if you guys did move forward with pods? What kind of effects have that had on young children?
Yeah, it is very funny you mentioned that. I was actually talking with my wife this morning about how India and actually our son Ephraim, they're kind of popular now because they're homeschooled. They end school earlier than most of the kids in the neighborhood who are still virtual learning. And so India's outside playing riding her bike, playing right now actually outside my window, building a hotel out of twigs and old cardboard boxes in the front yard. And kids come to her after they're done at 3:30 because they know she's already established the game. She already knows what they're going to play that day. And so they come to her to figure out what they're going to do. And so it's been fun for us to kind of see this we've kind of be able to lead by example of how you can socialize in the appropriate format. So the kids then go to the tree fort or they go to play in the neighborhood. And I think that's been like a really neat to see her kind of develop as the kind of a social ringleader, if you will, of someone who can bring people together. But it's also very unfortunate because a lot of these kids aren't able to see other kids throughout the day. And so maybe they'll catch up on India if there's a break time for 20-30 minutes because she's already outside because she did her homework all in the morning. And Amanda did a good job getting, my wife, did a good job getting school done that day. But, these other kids, they're finally just getting free. And they're in. And so it's like that moment. And it's been funny to kind of see, there's two things. Funny to see how different parents treat schooling and treat the educational system now. Some of them are far more cautious than we are, or far more nervous about getting together and stuff. But there's also parents who you can tell are like, thank goodness my kids are out of the house. Get them out of here. Let them go play. And so we kind of able to facilitate that. The other part of the thing is our HOA is actually relatively run by relatively older folks who don't have kids themselves. And there has been a kind of unfortunate reaction to the kids in the neighborhood trying to figure out how to deal with a COVID safe world. So some of the older folks have actually tried to introduce proposals that would reduce ways that kids can play outside. Like I saw a rule that said you couldn't play with chalk on certain sidewalks, or you couldn't do certain activities on the playground, like jumping, which is bizarre because that's what a playground is for. And the idea is that they're afraid of these kids getting hurt or whatever, but also it's like, it's a realization that because the kids are around the neighborhood more often, it's infringing upon the kind of quiet neighborhood that certain neighbors would like to have. And so it's this kind of weird not gender, but more of an age gap, cultural age gap between those in their 60s, 70s, 80s who don't want kids interrupting their bridge game, and those of us with kids people under the age of 40 who have kids who are trying to figure out what do we do with our children every day.
Sure. And I mean, you guys obviously have been able to branch out and provide these opportunities and let your kids and figure out what's best for your family. But for some kids, I mean, I'm thinking about like New York, who, they haven't even ventured outside in a while. That's not an option. And so, I think from your background in education and kind of your familiarity as a dad and new homeschool dad, what do you think the educational perspective on this is? Like, what kind of ramifications might this year-long shutdown setback put kids at in the next 5 to 10 years as they continue to mature throughout their academic discourse?
Oh, it's very frustrating to see how this will obviously stunt so many children, and particularly those who come from underprivileged neighborhoods or underprivileged families where you may have both parents who need to work, not because they can work, but because they need to provide the basics for the family, or maybe not have best internet connection, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little bit later, about how that lack of connectivity disables them from staying afloat. There's been a number of stories and reports, and we've talked about it even anecdotally, of kids that we've just kind of have fallen away and don't report. They're missing in classes. They're not taking the same attendance, and there's this kind of like forgotten, not generation, but a forgotten segment of the generation that it's gonna be really hard to catch up, and especially at these younger ages. That's such a developmental time for their growth, and to have that sort of jump from a solid foundation educational experience to a total drop off to nothing. And maybe we have some neighbors who watch other people's kids, and they talk about how these kids who are from more underprivileged families, they already have these other issues about taking care of the little ones, or taking care of acting as the parent in some ways, or providing food and that sort of stuff. It's exacerbated more and more by what we've seen over the past year, and without an end in sight, that's all going to make it more and more difficult for these kids to catch up. I think that's the biggest frustration about, discouraging of pods or discouraging of communities to do what's best for them. That even concept of takes a village. to be honest. She might have been onto something with that. The fact that we've been so afraid of acting as a community and acting as a village and kind of being kind of old school in that old world kind of approach of like everyone's there for each other. It has, I think, made it exacerbated these problems even more. And so you're not able to have the communities or the pods be able to help those in need in the same way that you should be, because we're discouraged from helping each other, because we're discouraged from acting in the basic functions of how a community should act.
So we know that these shutdowns are obviously having huge disparity, like just very massive implications on children and their educations. And you even mentioned parents, the ones who can't go back to work and all of that. Let's talk a little bit about why that's happening. So we've seen over the last year, some schools have returned, some schools haven't, but we've seen this primarily driving force of teachers unions who are lobbying against schools reopening and saying it's not safe. Well, data clearly shows across Europe, across the United States, that it is safe. The CDC has encouraged people to return. Even Dr. Fauci reversed his decision. So coming from your perspective, why do you think teachers unions continue to lobby against putting kids back in school? We've seen that it's a problem. We've seen that they need to get back for their academic, for their well-being, for their mental health. Why are we keeping kids out of school right now?
It's a great question. I would think that whether it's a teacher unions or certain school boards or certain entities affiliated in the school industrial complex, if you will, we're seeing this realization that the interests of those entities is not always the students or the parents. It's actually themselves. And there may be good reasons about fear of spread or fear of contagion, or if you're a teacher with a pre-existing condition, that might make you more nervous about that. And I think those are concerns that are understandable in a limited sense. But also there is this wanting to be seen as a first line defender without actually having to deal with the realities of being a first line, worker or person. And so I think I think that there needs to be a reality check that these entities need to either establish themselves as first line workers or not. And when they can make that decision, they should go forward and do its best for their community. But unfortunately, as you've talked about it, there's been such a narrative told to parents that they must accept the status quo for a year. And, teachers are generally one of the more trusted entities, because they're not the most highly paid. They do a generally good job with your kids. So there's no real reason to distrust them. And teacher unions are kind of nefarious, and we don't know what they do, but they're kind of behind. They're not that front and center. There's no person I can identify as, oh, I don't like that person, in the same way that you can a politician or someone else. And so I think that there's this, there is a sense that parents or just general voters or the public just assumes teachers have their best interests. And so maybe they do, maybe they don't. But instead of, encouraging parents to make the best decisions for themselves, people are told, oh, it's going to be difficult if you do these other things. Or if you choose a Christian school, you are perpetuating some systemic racism or systemic issue or something else. Or if you homeschool, look at all the people that you're hindering because your kid's not in the school anymore. All these or even charter schools get this way. Oh, these false narrative about them skimming the best students off the top of public schools. That's not necessarily true at all. But there are these narratives that come out of these of these discussions that I just think are really unfortunate and hinder the way we as a community can address and adjudicate these concerns long term. One of the best examples I see of that is Fairfax County public schools. I'm going to use them as an example. They're one of the largest school districts in the country. They're also the one I live in, so I have a lot of thoughts on them. They recently said I think a third of all teachers were not going to return to the classrooms even when the schools opened. And they were going to actually put proctors that were hired kids, 23, 24 years old, essentially substitute teachers, who are going to be in the classrooms because they have the least, they're least vulnerable to COVID. So they're going to be in the classroom, and the teachers are going to be remote. So the kids and the proctors are going to be in the classroom. The teachers are going to be remote. Well, it's funny is I heard conservative education policy advocates advocating for that a year ago. Now, why it took a year to have that as an idea, and that's your solution, that would have been an interesting solution in September for this year. instead of being a solution in the middle of the school year when some kids are in school, some people are not, some teachers are in school, some are not. And I just find that overly problematic. Now, with all that said, my concerns with teacher unions goes way beyond this past year, but even back to my former teaching days. I'm more than happy to share if you're interested at all.
Oh yes, I'm sure teachers unions we've seen, have wheedled their way in, and I think you raised an interesting point, and it kind of leads to a bigger debate, one that we're seeing play out even in the Biden administration, and that's the issue of choice. And it's something that's been on a lot of people's minds since the beginning of the pandemic. Do I have a choice to wear a mask? Do I have a choice to stay home? Do I have a choice to put my kid back in school or not? And I think it tends to become a political issue when it really shouldn't be a political issue. So what are your thoughts on what implications this kind of tragedy of children being out of school for a year may have on the school choice movement and people maybe potentially moving towards, more charter schools, lobbying for homeschooling, that sort of thing?
I think every couple of years for the past maybe decade and a half, we've seen new innovations in education system that are outside of the four walls of the public schools that have opened people up to thinking there are new options they should pursue, whether it's virtual learning as a full-time thing, which again, we've shown the limits within an education public school, but in some circumstances it could be effective. One of my homeschool kids upstairs is having a lot of fun right now. But either that or, charter schools, as you mentioned, or homeschools or classical schools or homeschool hybrid program. There's just a few of them. And I wouldn't say charter schools are the panacea, but they're an example of how parents, both in the inner city and suburbs and rural areas, can say, we want more ownership over what our kids decide to do. And I think that, there are aspects on the edges or details on the edges that should be ironed out and fixed and adjudicated and improved and constantly reworked to make sure we have a better approach. But, the idea of school choice, I think every few years has seen an opportunity for improvement. And I think this past year has shown that dramatically. And I think that, it's shown in a weird way, in an interesting way, that even the Atlantic magazine and others have highlighted that like homeschooling is a really valuable option, and it's an option that people should consider. And I think the biggest thing for me with this is it's also a choice that's easier to make if you're middle class or upper class. And I think what we should be striving to do, those who are advocates of school choice, is finding ways on the margins that we can improve the ability for those who are less fortunate or in the lower end of the socioeconomic scale to enable school choice. It should not be a privilege of those who can afford it, but for more communities to have access. And I think that's that what are little things that we can do to enable so that the mom or the dad could stay home? What are little things that we could do that could enable one of the parents to go from full-time to part-time to enable this? What are ways that you can use kind of a pod program or a one-room schoolhouse to make it work for kids at any level from kindergarten through 12th grade?
Sure. And what role do you think the government plays in kind of promoting this sort of school choice? Because I know we've seen, and even I've talked with some people about kind of the COVID relief bills and the money that's being designated to school reopenings is going to these school districts who are choosing to stay closed and going to programs that aren't helping lower class, people who need to go back to work and their kids need Wi-Fi to do their schoolwork. What role does the government play in promoting school choice or even giving the choice back to parents and students to fit what's best for their child in their location, in their state, etc.?
No, that's a great question. One of the ideas that I thought was really fascinating was there's been a lot of debate about broadband funding, or what's called the E-rate program. So there's been this effort, mostly led in part by Democrats who are trying to close what they call the homework gap, which is the idea that make sure all kids are connected. And so instead of actually, I think, innovating to come up with a new funding solution, they're just throwing money into an older program that has established in a pre-COVID age and may not be quite amended appropriately to deal with the current crisis that we're in. And so when the Democrats and the House were debating the idea of attaching E-rate funding and increase of $7 billion, I believe, into the current FCC's E-rate program that the FCC allocates for educational internet access, one of the Republicans, Tim Walberg of Michigan, actually had this idea to attach the funding to schools reopening. And the idea is that, like, if you're going to receive this money, you should also be, moving towards opening schools. And his point, I think, is actually, showing really clear that for some policymakers and some politicians, the idea of reopening, the idea of internet funding, funding for internet access, is actually a ploy to delay opening schools. It's like a carrot for schools to say that you can just stay closed, but we'll just give you internet access, so better internet funding, funding for internet access, and get kids devices and get kids better internet speeds, which will take a long time to adjudicate. It's going to take a long time to allocate fairly. But then also, we're not going to have any stick to encourage you to open up schools. So if you're a teacher union or you're a vested interest in the status quo, it's giving you less incentive to move in favor of opening schools, because now you can tell your constituency, you can tell your school board, you can tell your rest of your teachers guild or whatever it is, hey, we can just stay closed for as long as for a longer period of time, because the Democrats just allocate a whole new funding for our E-rate program and they're fine. And so actually I wrote an op-ed about this concept in the American Mind. Thank you for letting me do a little shout out to my piece. But it was actually on the idea of called Homeschoolers Use the Internet Too. And the idea that I had was, if you're going to expand this E-rate program, if you're going to expand funding for internet access in the education system, K through 12, why not make it in a way that would allow parents pursuing alternative education to use as well? Whether homeschooling, whether private school, Christian school, Catholic school, some other form of programming, maybe you should attach the money to the kid to make sure that the kids are having the access, or the parents are able to make the choices best for them, instead of dropping it off in a one lump sum to some nameless bureaucracy to decide for you down the road if you should have it. I think going back to that whole concept with the homeschoolers too, is my thinking was, for me and my wife, we could make this decision. We could afford to make this decision, and we're blessed to do that. But not everyone is blessed to do that. And so what are little things that we can do in the margins to make it easier to make that jump? And if you're going to open this spigot of funding for internet access, maybe you should think about ways that it can enable all parents and all students to take advantage of it to be successful. Look, I'm not always the biggest fan of these programs, but if you're going to do it, we should write the rules in a way that benefit as many people as possible and in a fair way, as opposed to benefiting those who are part of the public schools only.
Another interesting portion of this debate, I think, is that this proposed solution of, funding school choice, funding the ability for parents to decide what is best for their child, doesn't just apply to the pandemic. It also sort of bleeds into this other area where we've seen a lot of media attention recently, and that's kind of the imposition of critical race theory and other curriculum in public schools. And so I think one of the things about this debate is that, like I said earlier, it sort of becomes political. What are your thoughts on, parents' ability to decide what kind of curriculum, what kind of education their children are receiving?
I would say it was actually really funny. My wife was very happy to be showing that for the past month, we've been reading a lot of Frederick Douglass's actual words. We've been reading a lot about Sojourner Truth's actual words, and telling the stories of those individuals who have made this country better. Women of color, men of color, different communities, and how they tell how their stories have helped part of the fabric of who we are and improved the way our country is, and also teaching our kids to wrestle with some of the absolute unfairnesses that have existed throughout time, in the fact that there have been the justice system has not always applied equally under the law, and what are ways that we can improve that and learn from that and try to be better going forward. I don't have to call that CRT. I don't have to call that the 1619 Project. I don't have to call that a specific phrase, just other than just to say, like, I'm teaching my kids to do and live their lives in a better way, in a more virtuous way than maybe I did, or my parents' generation, or others. And so I think that there are lessons to be learned from the current cultural debates and the current academic discussions about how we can move forward and be a better community and be more virtuous and more civil and civic minded. But I am so careful to accept all of the premises of certain newfangled ideas, if you will, and that I don't think have always lived up to the scrutiny that other things have. And so I think that's fair. I mean, that's one thing about the school choice that does allow us to do is especially at the homeschool level, is to make those decisions for ourselves. Talk about sex ed at the time that's appropriate for my kid, maybe not kindergarten, maybe later on, to deal with questions of equality and equity. What do those terms mean? Thinking about the benefits of socialism, or the not benefits of socialism, or the benefits of capitalism, or the pitfalls of capitalism. What has worked in the past, what has not worked in the past, how can we move ahead? I think what you're getting at, and I think that this is kind of how I see it, is that homeschooling and classical education and others are helping the kid develop the critical thinking skills from a very early age. And I think that's what's important, to wrestle with these conversations about race and society and religion and others. It's important that kids are able to learn those thinking skills early on, instead of being told from an authority figure how to think about an issue. And therefore, this philosophy is accepted, or this one is, but not that one. Never touch that one. And I think that it's important for us to expose our kids in a right way, in a time, in a proper course, a proper fashion, to these new ideas and new thoughts, but not dictate to them how they should think. And I think that's the real question. And in fact, actually, I think that's what one of my favorite theologians, and actually probably an education mentor, Francis Schaeffer, talked about, is how shall we then live? The concept of, these are the issues ahead of us. How do we then go from here? Whether it's engaging in the arts, culture, politics, fashion, society, how do we kind of go from there?
I do think that is one of the bigger appeals of this kind of pro school choice thing, is that you have the ability to provide all of the information and let people deduce, and it kind of promotes this open-mindedness that you're not really seeing anymore, especially at higher education levels, but even now starting to creep into elementary schools, high schools, and middle schools, is this promotion of free thinking and free thought. And so I think that is one of the benefits of homeschooling, or maybe choosing an education different than public school. What are some of the other pros or benefits that your family has seen over the last 6 or so months that you guys have been homeschooling?
Education is everywhere. Like that's what's so cool, is that I can literally turn any conversation with my child into a learning moment, not just as a parent, but as a teacher. I think my wife and I have seen that. I mean, every conversation, whether it's going for a tour of Mount Vernon next door, near our house, to driving back past the Capitol and explain to the kids, why is there a fence there? When is that going down? What's that mean? Those are type of things that we can get started on from an early age. The other thing is that, like, we have spring break coming up. I don't know what we're going to do for spring break because we're in the midst of COVID, but like, I'm able to take whatever trip we do could turn into an educational experience in a way that it wouldn't before. And that's what I really enjoy about this kind of approach to learning. And in fairness, I was homeschooled for a large part of my growth, so my upbringing. So I did have exposure to it. And I think both my parents and I think we're trying to continue that too, is take every opportunity to be a chance to enable our kids to independently learn and experience the world in a whole new way, and not have the guardrails around them to say, oh, this is acceptable or this is not. The other thing is, I trust my wife completely to discuss these issues with my kids, these complicated questions. When the January 6th event happened and we had it on TV and we're able to talk to our kid about it, and India and I are having conversations for the next couple of days about it. I didn't have to worry about what the teacher was going to say, or what color they voted for, red or blue, in the election, and how that might shape the way they view things. I was able to kind of share these ideas to my daughter. And I think I'm a pretty heterodox kind of guy anyway. How can I teach my kid, ideas that don't fit into one category or the other in a way that I think is just really productive. I don't think every kid has that opportunity. I think this is really important for our students. The other thing about school choice that I love in the past year has been a flexible schedule. I mean, it's great. I mean, it really is kind of awesome. Kids at my daughter's age of 8, they're not supposed to be up that early. We get kids up earlier so that because of the bus system, and so they get to school up by 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the morning. They get going. They don't end until 3:30 in the afternoon. Which, by the way, half that time at first and second grade is just like lining up and making sure everyone is like standing quietly and obeying the teacher, and half the time is actually teaching the kids anything. So I'm able to cut all of that out because we're able to start when it's good for us, when it's good for an 8-year-old to start, which might be 9 o'clock, might be 8:30 on some days, might be 9:30 on some days. And then she's able to be ending, sometime in the early afternoon, far ahead of her friends. And she learned a lot more. So it's like a good use of our time. It's way more economical. And so it's been really enjoyable. But school doesn't end. Even after school is ending, we were able to find little ways of teaching our kids things. I will say this. I never realized that the card game Dutch Blitz that I learned as a kid can be so helpful for math. Like, you're able to play Dutch Blitz and you're teaching my kids how to count and do by threes and, multiply things and subtract and all this stuff. Who knew the Amish were so good at card games and could actually teach us things that our kids could use as educational tools going forward? And she doesn't even know she's learning math. She's having fun. It's crazy.
I think that is one of the interesting and maybe a salvaged pro of this pandemic is the burden of the proof of the education of your children has fallen on parents, whether you like it or not. They've been home with their children for a year now. And I was homeschooled all throughout my time. And I totally, completely agree with the premise of like, the classroom never ends. There's always a learning opportunity. There's always a time and place when a parent can step in. And, we've seen over the years, studies come out and say, read with your child as early as, 6 months old, and they'll grow up and they'll be ready for the academic environment and that kind of thing. They want to learn. And so I think, the hope is that parents have taken this opportunity to teach their kids. What are your thoughts on that? Have you seen any of those examples in your own community?
Yeah, what's been fun to watch is how parents have taken the opportunity to understand that each kid's individualized approach. Every kid has multiple intelligences. Some kids might be good in certain things. Kids might be other things, but there are things that some kids are good at. There are little things here or there that you should explore and try to find to help that kid be more successful and find that talent that they've been given in some way or another. It's not every kid's not going to grow up to be the president, but every kid, there are some skills and unique talents that they can find that you as a parent or the teacher should be trying to figure out how to unlock that and how to move that ahead to the next step. And so, I think that's been really a neat thing to see parents kind of learning that about their children in a whole new way of like, they're around them all the time. They're starting to see them, in front of the computer screen, what they're good at, what they're not good at. And I think every parent has this urge to try to find ways to test their kids in new ways educationally. So I think it is good. I think it's a good opportunity for parents to get in touch with their children and to find new ways that they can be productive and curtail them in the right direction to help them be successful. I also got to say, some of the parents I know who have high school kids have been rethinking the way they're thinking about college, thinking about alternatives to college, thinking about, well, maybe a kid shouldn't go to this super expensive 4-year school, but maybe they should do this. They should do some classes from home remotely and try to get some of the gen ed courses out of the way now so they can, use the best colleges for the actual differentiated approach and further education when they're actually ready to, instead of being forced at age 18 to figure out what their life choices are going to be, which sometimes is very difficult. So I think that's a good thing overall as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, the age-old question is when will we get back to normal? When will schools get back to normal? Do you think there's going to be a normal, or do you think that we're going to come back and see a lot more of these different adapted approaches and maybe people gravitating away from public schools and generalized normal, choices?
The recent conversation about reopening schools is focused now less on COVID, but now like long-standing gripes certain interests have had about the way schools are set up, or we need a new ventilation system, or we need to make the schools bigger, or we need the classrooms to have more bells and whistles in the name of COVID, but actually just because they want to have a more comfortable setup for themselves or make it look fancy or whatever it is. And I think that's a real problem long term, is that I am worried that these schools and school interests will use the COVID pandemic as an excuse to enact things that they've wanted that are more of importance to teachers than the students long term. And so you see these weird memes and pictures of schools with like kids in like, you know, individual bubbles and all of this stuff. My wife told me her friend is a first grade teacher. They got rid of all the cubbies for the kids in first grade. They got rid of the cubbies for the kids, and they took all the books out of the, you know, classroom library, because heaven forbid you get COVID. You know, I don't know how, by touching a book somehow, which I don't get how that makes any sense. But like, it doesn't spread on surfaces. So it makes no, again, that's whatever. My point is, like, they're changing the way these schoolrooms look to be more sterile, to be more, to be less, you know, inviting for young kids. And I think that's just so problematic, and it's so worrisome to me, that I am worried that when we return, that some of those aspects that she liked about the classroom will go away. And I also think that it's also on the other end of the spectrum for kids in high school or older kids. You know, maybe there are kids who actually benefit from an individualized education system. Maybe virtual school can work for some kids. And I hope that we don't say that all kids in high school have to go back to doing the same thing they did before, but we find ways that, like, hey, these kids are older, maybe they should do a college class. Instead of taking a senior math, maybe they should take a freshman intro to algebra, intro to math for college. I don't know, whatever that class is, to get that out of the way. Maybe there are ways that we could be more creative to let these kids who are sophomores, juniors, seniors in high school to get ahead in their life, instead of learning all these, you know, latest trends and Twitter discernment on culture and all this other stuff. Maybe they should get ahead in actual things that can help them become better professionals and better parents and better adults.
It's all about the choice, isn't it?
Should be about the choice, exactly.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathan, for joining me for this conversation. I really appreciated your insight, and best of luck with the rest of you guys' school year.
Well, thank you so much. And it's great to be on here. Hopefully you found it as helpful as I did, but it's great to chat with you, and thanks again.